At the heart of Buddhist teachings lies a profound and perplexing puzzle concerning the nature of truth, Sakka in Pali, a concept that seems to oscillate between certainty and ambiguity in the Buddha's discourses. This enigma, deeply embedded in the Pali Canon, the earliest collection of Buddhist scriptures, presents itself as a paradox that has intrigued scholars, practitioners, and philosophers for centuries. On one hand, the Buddha unequivocally presents the Four Noble Truths as foundational, categorical realities that hold universal validity. In texts such as Nikaya 9, these truths, suffering, its cause, its cessation, and the path leading to its cessation, are upheld as absolute, transcending personal opinion or situational variance. They are portrayed as the bedrock of the Buddha's enlightenment and the map for all who seek liberation. Furthermore, in Majjhima Nikaya 95, the attainment of awakening itself is described as synonymous with the attainment of truth, suggesting that truth is not merely an abstract idea but an experiential reality that defines the ultimate goal of the Buddhist path. Yet, this apparent certainty is juxtaposed with another perspective found in the Pali Canon, particularly in the Ahakavagga of the Sutta Nipata, Chapter 4, a collection of poetic discourses that challenge the very notion of clinging to truth as a fixed or definitive stance. Here, the Buddha appears to transcend the binary of true and false, suggesting a state of liberation that lies beyond the need to assert or defend any position. For instance, in Sutta Nipata 4:9, the text poses a rhetorical question of what would the Brahmin say true or false, disputing with whom, he and whom equal, unequal or not. This implies a detachment from the conventional frameworks of judgment. Similarly, in Sutta Nipata 4:8, the Buddha observes, those who dispute, taking hold of a view, saying, this, and this only, is true, those you can talk to. Here there is nothing, no confrontation at the birth of disputes. These passages paint a picture of a sage who refrains from grasping at doctrines or engaging in the contentious debates that characterize ordinary human discourse. Truth, in this light, seems less like a possession to be claimed and more like a state to be realized, one that eludes the rigid categories of right and wrong. This duality extends beyond truth to the related concept of views, daihai, the opinions or perspectives individuals adopt about reality. The Pali Canon draws a sharp distinction between right view and wrong view, asserting in Sayutta Nikaya 45:8 that perceiving existence through the lens of the Four Noble Truths constitutes right view, an indispensable component of the Noble Eightfold Path that leads to the end of suffering. Yet, in the same Ahakavagga, we encounter verses that celebrate a state of peace achieved by relinquishing all views entirely. Sutta Nipata 4:3 declares, he has nothing embraced or rejected, has sloughed off every view right here, every one, while Sutta Nipata 4:5 asks, by whom, with what, should he be pigeonholed here in the world, this Brahmin who hasn't adopted views? These lines suggest that true liberation involves a radical freedom from even the subtlest attachment to intellectual positions, including those deemed correct. What emerges from this interplay of ideas is a central question. How can the Buddha assert the Four Noble Truths as universally true while simultaneously advocating a transcendence of all assertions of truth and views? Is this a deliberate paradox meant to provoke deeper reflection? Or does it reflect an inconsistency in the teachings? The puzzle of truth in Buddhism, then, is not merely a scholarly curiosity but a practical challenge for those walking the path. It invites us to reconsider our relationship with truth, not as a static doctrine to be defended, but as a dynamic tool for liberation that must eventually be set aside. This introduction sets the stage for exploring how these seeming contradictions might be reconciled, and what they reveal about the Buddha's nuanced approach to guiding humanity beyond suffering. The apparent contradictions within the Pali Canon regarding the nature of truth, Sakka, and views, daihai, have given rise to two principal interpretive approaches, each offering a distinct lens through which to understand the Buddha's teachings. These approaches differ not only in their assumptions about the coherence of the canon but also in their implications for how practitioners should relate to truth and views on the path to liberation. By examining these perspectives, we can begin to unravel the complexity of the Buddha's paradoxical statements and discern whether they serve as intentional challenges to conventional thinking or as artifacts of historical development. The first approach views the Buddha's teachings on truth and views as inherently subtle and multifaceted, suggesting that the contradictions in the Pali Canon are not errors or inconsistencies but deliberate paradoxes designed to reflect the depth of his insight. Proponents of this perspective argue that the Buddha's seemingly conflicting statements, such as affirming the categorical validity of the Four Noble Truths while simultaneously advocating detachment from all assertions, can coexist because they address different aspects of the spiritual journey or operate in distinct contexts. For example, the assertion of the Four Noble Truths as universal principles, Nikaya 9, might serve as a foundational teaching for beginners, providing a clear framework to orient their practice, while the transcendence of true/false dichotomies in the Ahakavagga, Sutta Nipata 4, could reflect the perspective of an advanced practitioner who has already internalized these truths and moved beyond conceptual clinging. This approach posits that the Buddha may have employed the terms truth and views with varying shades of meaning depending on the situation. For instance, truth might refer to an experiential reality, such as the cessation of suffering, in some contexts, and to verbal statements about reality in others. Similarly, views could denote rigid, dogmatic opinions in one instance and skillful perspectives conducive to liberation in another. The question then becomes, can these paradoxes be resolved by a careful analysis of the canon? Scholars and practitioners adopting this view might investigate whether the Buddha recommended different ways of relating to truths and views at different stages of the path, holding them firmly as guides during early practice, then relinquishing them upon awakening. This method requires a meticulous reading of the texts to detect nuances, such as how the Buddha's audience or the specific problem being addressed might influence his choice of words. The strength of this approach lies in its respect for the complexity of the teachings, seeing the paradoxes as invitations to deeper contemplation rather than obstacles to be smoothed over. In contrast, the second approach assumes that the Buddha's stance on truth and views was fundamentally straightforward and consistent across all contexts, with no variation based on stages of practice or rhetorical intent. Advocates of this perspective argue that the Buddha defined his terms, such as truth and views, uniformly throughout his teachings, and that any apparent contradictions must therefore indicate a divergence between his original message and later interpolations by his followers. From this standpoint, only one side of the paradox can accurately reflect the Buddha's authentic position, while the other must be dismissed as an inauthentic addition introduced after his lifetime. For example, if one takes the Ahakavagga's emphasis on transcending all views and assertions, Sutta Nipata 4-3, 4-8, as the Buddha's true teaching, then the passages upholding the Four Noble Truths as categorical, Nikaya 9, and right view as essential, Sayutta Nikaya 45-8, might be seen as later elaborations by disciples who misunderstood or formalized his message. Conversely, if one prioritizes the Four Noble Truths and right view as the core of the Buddha's doctrine, the Ahakavagga's apparent rejection of fixed positions could be interpreted as an aberration or a poetic exaggeration not representative of his broader teachings. This approach often aligns with historical critical methods, where scholars attempt to stratify the canon into early and late layers, with the Ahakavagga frequently cited as an older text due to its mention elsewhere in the canon, e.g., in other Nikayas, suggesting it predates and thus holds greater authenticity than other sections. The simplicity of this method lies in its binary logic. One side of the contradiction is deemed authoritative, and the other is relegated to the status of a historical artifact. For those who favor the Ahakavagga as the original teaching, the implication is that the Buddha rejected all notions of objective truth and right/wrong distinctions, favoring a radical freedom from conceptual frameworks. This has led some to draw parallels with Western philosophies like agnosticism or relativism. However, this approach risks oversimplification, potentially overlooking the richness of the canon's diversity and the possibility that the Buddha intentionally wove paradoxical elements into his teachings to address the multifaceted nature of human experience. The subtle approach embraces the coexistence of affirmation and transcendence, seeing them as complementary rather than mutually exclusive. It suggests that the Buddha's teachings are dynamic, adapting to the needs of his listeners and the stages of their practice, much like a physician prescribing different remedies for different ailments. The simple approach, by contrast, seeks a single, unambiguous thread running through the canon, prioritizing historical authenticity over philosophical complexity. While the subtle approach demands greater interpretive effort and tolerance for ambiguity, the simple approach offers clarity at the cost of potentially discounting significant portions of the textual tradition. The choice between them shapes not only how one understands the Buddha's message but also how one applies it, whether as a layered journey through paradox or as a streamlined path to a singular truth. The paradoxes surrounding truth, sakka, and views, daihai, in the Pali Canon invite a deeper investigation into the meanings of these terms, revealing that they are not singular or static but carry dual dimensions that shift depending on context and purpose. This duality offers a key to reconciling the apparent contradictions in the Buddha's teachings, between the affirmation of categorical truths like the Four Noble Truths and the call to transcend all assertions, and challenges the assumption that these concepts must be understood in a uniform way across the canon. By exploring these dual meanings, we can uncover how the Buddha's approach to truth and views reflects both practical guidance for the path and a profound insight into the nature of liberation. In the Pali Canon, truth operates on two distinct yet interconnected levels, a nuance often lost in Western interpretations that equate truth solely with propositional statements. First, truth can denote an experiential reality, an event, state, or phenomenon that exists independently of language or belief. This is most vividly illustrated in the Buddha's descriptions of unbinding, Nibbana, the cessation of suffering, which he calls the highest noble truth in Majjhima Nikaya 140. Whatever is deceptive is false, unbinding, the undeceptive, is true. Here, truth is not a claim to be argued but a lived experience, a dimension of reality that the awakened mind directly encounters. Similarly, in Majjhima Nikaya 95, the attainment of awakening is equated with realizing the ultimate meaning of the truth with the body, emphasizing a visceral, non-conceptual engagement with truth as an existential fact rather than a verbal formulation. The second meaning of truth refers to statements or propositions about reality, articulations that attempt to describe or point to these experiential truths. This is evident in the Buddha's teaching of the Four Noble Truths, where each truth is accompanied by a specific duty. Suffering is to be comprehended, its cause abandoned, its cessation realized, and the path developed. Sayana Nikaya 56:11. These duties apply not to the statements themselves but to the realities they signify, yet the statements serve as essential tools for guiding practitioners toward those realities. The interplay between these two senses of truth, reality, and its expression helps explain the paradox. A fully awakened person attains the truth as an unconditioned state, Nibbana, but no longer clings to statements about it, which are conditioned and thus provisional. For those still on the path, however, these statements remain vital as maps to that destination. Similarly, views, daihai, in the canon carry a dual significance, oscillating between detrimental attachments and skillful means. On one hand, views are portrayed as rigid, dogmatic opinions that bind individuals to suffering. The Ahakavagga frequently critiques those who cling to their idiosyncratic truths, Paksikasaka, asserting, for example, only here is their purity, that's what they say, no other doctrines are pure, so they say, Satanapada 4:8. Such views fuel disputes and reinforce the ego, tethering the mind to a cycle of craving and conflict. In Satanapada 4:12, the Buddha notes, I don't say, that's how it is, the way fools tell one another. They each make out their views to be true and so regard their opponents as fools, highlighting how attachment to views breeds division and delusion. On the other hand, the canon elevates right view, Samadhi, as an indispensable factor of the Noble Eightfold Path, aligning it with the Four Noble Truths, Sayana Nikaya 45:8. Far from being a dogmatic stance, right view is a skillful perspective that orients the mind toward liberation, identifying the causes of suffering, e.g., craving for sensuality, becoming, and non-becoming, as in Satanapada 4:1-2, and the means to their cessation. Even within the Ahakavagga, passages like Satanapada 4:16 affirm practices such as right resolve and concentration, suggesting that certain views are not only valid but necessary for progress. Thus, views can be obstructive when clung to as ends in themselves, yet transformative when used as tools to dismantle clinging and awaken insight. The dual meanings of truth and views take on added significance when viewed through the lens of the Ahakavagga, a collection of poems in the Fifth Nikaya of the Pali Canon, often regarded as one of its oldest sections. Because it is referenced in other parts of the canon, e.g., in the first four Nikayas, some scholars argue that it predates much of the textual tradition, lending weight to the idea that its emphasis on transcending views and assertions reflects the Buddha's original teaching. Passages like Satanapada 4:3, he has nothing embraced or rejected, has sloughed off every view right here, and Satanapada 4:9, of what would the Brahmin say true or false, have led proponents of this simple approach to conclude that the Buddha rejected all fixed notions of truth and right/wrong, and that later affirmations of the Four Noble Truths, e.g., in the Vinaya or the first four Nikayas, represent formalized additions by his followers. This interpretation, however, falters when the Ahakavagga is examined more closely. Far from denying all truths, it critiques only those that lack universal validity, as seen in Satanapada 4:12, the truth is one. There is no second about which a person who knows it would argue with one who knows. Moreover, the text aligns with the Four Noble Truths by acknowledging craving as a cause of suffering, SN 4:1-2, and unbinding as the goal, SN 4:15. This suggests that its rejection of true and false applies not to all truths but to subjective, divisive claims, a subtlety lost in oversimplified readings. The first four Nikayas reinforce this by depicting awakened beings as free from clinging to views, Aguttara Nikaya 4:24, while still valuing right view as a guide, Sayana Nikaya 22:39. The consistency across the canon undermines the notion of a sharp divide between the Ahakavagga and other texts, pointing instead to a unified framework where truth and views serve distinct roles. Recognizing these dual meanings reframes the Buddha's paradoxes as a deliberate strategy rather than a historical inconsistency. Truth as reality, e.g., Nibbana, is the ultimate aim, while truth as statement, e.g., the Four Noble Truths, is the means. Views as attachments obstruct liberation, while views as right understanding propel it. This duality implies a progression. Practitioners rely on propositional truths and right views to navigate the path, cultivating discernment and dispassion, but upon reaching awakening, they release even these tools, much like a traveler discards a raft after crossing a river. The Ahakavaga's poetic riddles, with their paradoxes and wordplay, serve not to negate truth but to guard against its misuse, urging a flexible, pragmatic engagement with concepts that ultimately leads beyond them. Exploring these meanings thus reveals the Buddha's teachings as both a practical roadmap and a profound meditation on the limits of language and thought. The Four Noble Truths stand as the cornerstone of the Buddha's teachings, serving not only as a diagnosis of the human condition but also as a practical framework for liberation. Far from being abstract doctrines or mere philosophical assertions, they function as a dynamic guide, a set of principles that orient practitioners toward the cessation of suffering and illuminate the path to awakening. Within the context of the Pali Canon's paradoxes about truth and views, the Four Noble Truths emerge as a vital thread that reconciles the tension between affirming categorical truths and transcending all attachments. Their role is both foundational and instrumental, providing clarity for those on the path while subtly preparing them to release even these truths upon reaching their ultimate goal. The Buddha presents the Four Noble Truths: suffering, dukkha, its cause; samudaya, its cessation; nirodha, and the path leading to its cessation; magga, as universal realities that hold true across all contexts, as seen in texts like Nikaya 9. Unlike subjective opinions or idiosyncratic beliefs, these truths are not contingent on individual perspectives. They describe the fundamental nature of existence as experienced by all beings trapped in the cycle of birth and death, Sasra. In Sayutta Nikaya 56:11, the Buddha assigns specific duties to each truth. Suffering is to be fully comprehended, its cause, craving, abandoned, its cessation realized, and the path developed. This structured approach underscores their status as actionable truths, realities to be engaged with rather than debated or clung to as intellectual positions. Their categorical nature provides a reliable anchor for practitioners, ensuring that the path to liberation is grounded in an objective understanding of cause and effect. Central to the Four Noble Truths is their expression through right view, samudaya, the first factor of the Noble Eightfold Path. In Sayutta Nikaya 45:8, right view is defined as seeing existence through the lens of these truths, recognizing suffering, understanding its origin and craving, envisioning its cessation, and committing to the practices that lead there. This perspective is not optional but indispensable, forming the intellectual and ethical groundwork for the entire path. Even within the Ahakavagga, often cited for its critique of clinging to views, the Four Noble Truths find echoes. For instance, Sutta Nipata 4:1 and 4:2 identify craving for sensuality, becoming, and non-becoming as causes of suffering, aligning with the second noble truth, while Sutta Nipata 4:15 extols unbinding, nibbana, as the ultimate goal, mirroring the third. Sutta Nipata 4:16 further recommends practices like right resolve, right speech, right action, and jhana, meditative absorption, as right concentration, resonating with the Fourth Noble Truth's emphasis on the Eightfold Path. This integration demonstrates that the Four Noble Truths are not at odds with the Ahakavaga's call to transcend views. Rather, they represent a skillful form of view, right view, that serves a purpose beyond itself. They are tools for dismantling the very attachments they address, guiding practitioners to a state where clinging, even to these truths, becomes irrelevant. The Four Noble Truths also play a critical role in countering the proliferation of subjective or idiosyncratic truths, Paksikasaka, critiqued in the Ahakavagga. In Sutta Nipata 4:8, the Buddha describes those who insist, only here is their purity, that's what they say, no other doctrines are pure, highlighting the divisive nature of personal convictions that lack universal validity. In contrast, he asserts in Sutta Nipata 4:12, the truth is one. There is no second about which a person who knows it would argue with one who knows. This dialogue positions the Four Noble Truths as a singular, objective truth that transcends dispute, not because it demands blind allegiance, but because it aligns with the reality of suffering and its cessation as verifiable through direct experience. Those who truly understand these truths, the Buddha suggests, find no basis for contention, as their insight converges on the same unconditioned reality. This stance refutes interpretations that portray the Buddha as an agnostic or relativist, as some scholars have suggested based on selective readings of the Ahakavagga. Instead, the Four Noble Truths provide a consistent standard against which all other claims can be measured, ensuring that the path remains rooted in a shared, observable truth rather than individual whims. The practical role of the Four Noble Truths lies in their ability to transform abstract understanding into concrete action. Each truth carries a specific task that engages the practitioner at every level: mental, emotional, and physical. Comprehending suffering involves recognizing its pervasive presence in life, from physical pain to the subtle unease of impermanence. Abandoning its cause requires uprooting craving through mindfulness and ethical discipline. Realizing cessation entails experiencing moments of peace that foreshadow Nibbana, while developing the path involves cultivating the Eightfold Path's factors: right view, intention, speech, action, livelihood, effort, mindfulness, and concentration, in a holistic, integrated way. This framework is not static but dynamic, adapting to the practitioner's progress. Early in the path, the Four Noble Truths provide clarity and motivation, helping novices discern the difference between skillful and unskillful actions. As practice deepens, they foster dispassion by revealing the impermanent, conditioned nature of all phenomena, including the craving that binds the mind. Ultimately, they prepare the practitioner for release, as seen in Majjhima Nikaya 117, where right view leads to the development of all path factors, culminating in a state of total freedom. The Ahakavagga's emphasis on letting go of views complements this process, suggesting that once the Four Noble Truths have fulfilled their purpose, guiding the mind to Nibbana, they too can be relinquished, like a raft left behind after crossing a river. The Four Noble Truths thus bridge the canon's paradoxical teachings on truth and views. They are affirmed as categorical because they correspond to reality and effectively lead to liberation, yet they are not ends in themselves. Their role is provisional, designed to be held with conviction during the journey but released upon awakening, when the mind no longer needs conceptual supports. This resolves the tension between the Buddha's assertion of their truth, e.g., in Daya Nikaya 9, and his transcendence of all assertions, e.g., in Sutta Nipata 4:9. The Four Noble Truths guide the path by providing a reliable map, yet their ultimate purpose is to bring the practitioner to a point where maps are no longer necessary, a state of direct, unmediated realization. In this way, they embody both the stability of truth and the flexibility of non-attachment, serving as the Buddha's masterful response to the human struggle with suffering. The paradoxes surrounding truth, Sakka, and views, Daihai, in the Pali Canon, affirming the Four Noble Truths as categorical while advocating a transcendence of all assertions, might appear irreconcilable at first glance. However, a closer examination reveals that these tensions are not contradictions but deliberate pointers to a deeper truth about the Buddhist path. The resolution lies in understanding how the Buddha employs these concepts as dynamic tools rather than static absolutes, guiding practitioners toward liberation while preparing them to release even the tools themselves. This section unravels the paradox by exploring the dual meanings of truth, the stages of engagement with views, and the process by which fixed attachments are transcended, culminating in the unconditioned state of awakening. A key to unbinding this paradox is recognizing that truth in the Pali Canon operates on two distinct levels, each with its own implications for practice and realization. First, Truth refers to an experiential reality, an event or state that exists beyond words or concepts. This is epitomized in the Buddha's description of unbinding, Nibbana, the cessation of suffering, as the highest noble truth in Majjhima Nikaya 140. Whatever is deceptive is false, unbinding, the undeceptive, is true. Here, truth is not a proposition to be debated but a lived experience, a deathless dimension free from conditions and attachments. Similarly, Majjhima Nikaya 95 speaks of realizing the ultimate meaning of the truth with the body, suggesting a direct, embodied encounter with this reality, unmediated by intellectual constructs. Second, truth refers to statements or teachings about reality, such as the Four Noble Truths themselves. In Sayana Nikaya 56:11, the Buddha outlines duties for each truth, comprehending suffering, abandoning its cause, realizing its cessation, and developing the path, indicating that these statements point to actionable realities rather than serving as ends in themselves. The paradox resolves when we see these meanings in relation. A fully awakened person attains the truth as an unconditioned state, Nibbana, and thus no longer clings to conditioned statements about it, even true ones. For those on the path, however, these statements are indispensable guides, shaping perception and action until the goal is reached. This dual nature explains why the Buddha can assert the Four Noble Truths as categorical, Daya Nikaya 9, while also transcending assertions of true and false, Sutta Nipata 4:9. The experiential truth of Nibbana is the ultimate destination, while propositional truths are the raft that carries one there, a raft that must be abandoned once the shore is reached, as illustrated in the famous simile of the raft in Majjhima Nikaya 22. The paradox extends to views, Daihai, which the canon both praises as right view and critiques as objects of clinging. Resolving this tension requires understanding views as part of a progressive process. On the path, right view, aligned with the Four Noble Truths, is essential. It provides a framework for discerning suffering's causes, e.g., craving, and cultivating the practices, e.g., the Eightfold Path, that lead to their cessation. Yet, this reliance is temporary. The Ahakavagga hints at this in Sutta Nipata 4:9. One doesn't describe purity in terms of view, learning, knowledge, habit, or practice. Nor is it found by a person through lack of view. This suggests that liberation is neither achieved by clinging to views nor by rejecting them outright in ignorance. It requires a skillful engagement followed by transcendence. The simile of the raft, Majjhima Nikaya 22, vividly illustrates this dynamic. A man builds a raft to cross a river, relying on it fully during the journey. Once he reaches the far shore, however, he doesn't carry it onward but leaves it behind, recognizing its purpose has been fulfilled. Similarly, practitioners depend on right view to navigate the currents of suffering, but upon attaining awakening, they release it, as clinging to any view, even a correct one, would tether them to the conditioned world they've transcended. The paradox, then, reflects two stages: dependence on views as a means, and freedom from them as the end. Transcending fixed views is not a passive act of denial but an active process rooted in understanding and dispassion. Simply telling oneself to abandon views is insufficient. One must comprehend why the mind clings to them and develop genuine detachment from those causes. The canon identifies craving and ignorance as the roots of attachment to views, e.g., Sayana Nikaya 22 hours 81 minutes, and right view serves as the tool to uproot them. By seeing phenomena as impermanent, stressful, and not self, Sutta Nipata 4:10, practitioners loosen their grip on fixed positions, recognizing them as conditioned fabrications unworthy of obsession. This process unfolds gradually. Early on, right view clarifies the path, countering wrong views, like trying to milk a cow by twisting its horn, Majjhima Nikaya 126, with effective understanding, akin to pulling the udder. As insight deepens, it fosters dispassion, not just for wrong views but for all views, including itself. The awakened mind, having used right view to dismantle clinging, releases even the discernment that led to liberation, as described in Daya Nikaya 1, discerning that, he does not grasp at that act of discerning, unbinding is experienced right within. This final release marks the transcendence of fixed views, aligning with the Ahakavaga's vision of a sage free from equal or unequal, Satanapada 4:9. The paradox unravels when we see truth and views as relational rather than absolute. The Four Noble Truths are true because they correspond to reality and lead to liberation, but their propositional form is a conditioned means, not the unconditioned end. Views are fixed obstacles when clung to as identity or dogma, yet fluid guides when held lightly as part of the path. The Buddha's teachings thus operate on two levels. For those still crossing the river, truth and right view provide stability and direction. For those who've reached the shore, they dissolve into the silence of Nibbana. This reconciliation highlights the Buddha's pragmatic genius, affirming truths to guide action, while planting the seeds for their transcendence to ensure liberation remains unencumbered by concepts. Practically, this resolution means embracing right view with commitment but without attachment. Practitioners rely on the Four Noble Truths as a compass, trusting their efficacy while remaining open to their ultimate relinquishment. The process of transcending views, through comprehension, dispassion, and release, mirrors the path itself, making the paradox not a barrier but a map to freedom. By navigating this tension, one moves from the fixed to the fluid, from dependence to unbinding, fulfilling the Buddha's promise of a truth that liberates rather than binds. The Buddha's teachings on truth and views, with their paradoxical interplay of affirmation and transcendence, are not mere intellectual exercises but carry profound practical implications for ending suffering, dukkha. Far from being abstract or theoretical, these concepts serve as actionable tools designed to guide practitioners through the complexities of the mind and the realities of existence. By understanding how to adopt and use truths and views effectively, particularly the Four Noble Truths and right view, individuals can transform their relationship with suffering, moving from entanglement to liberation. This section explores the practical dimensions of this approach, emphasizing the adoption of effective views, their proper application, and the standards by which they are judged, all aimed at achieving the ultimate goal of unbinding. The practical application of the Buddha's teachings begins with adopting right view, samadhi, a perspective aligned with the Four Noble Truths, and using it as a foundation for action. In the simile of the raft, Majjhima Nikaya 22, the Buddha compares right view to a raft that must be held firmly while crossing the river of suffering, yet abandoned once the far shore of liberation is reached. This metaphor underscores two key principles for practice. 1. Reliance on right view as an effective tool during the journey, and 2. Readiness to let it go when its purpose is fulfilled. Practically, this means embracing the Four Noble Truths, comprehending suffering, abandoning its cause, craving, realizing its cessation, and developing the path, with a commitment to their transformative potential, while avoiding the trap of turning them into fixed dogmas or badges of identity. For those on the path, adopting right view involves a deliberate shift in perception. It requires seeing phenomena as impermanent, stressful, and not self, anicca, dukkha, anatta, as taught in Satanapada 4:10, rather than clinging to illusions of permanence or selfhood. This shift is not passive but active, demanding mindfulness and effort to counteract habitual wrong views, such as the belief that happiness lies in sensual pleasures or eternal existence. Majjhima Nikaya 126 illustrates this with vivid analogies, adopting wrong views is like trying to get milk by twisting a cow's horn or sesame oil by grinding gravel, futile and misguided, while right view is like pulling the udder or grinding sesame seeds, effective and aligned with reality. Practically, this means replacing unskillful assumptions with a clear understanding of cause and effect, rooted in the Four Noble Truths, to guide actions toward liberation. The Buddha's pragmatic approach to truth emphasizes judging views not by their abstract correctness but by their practical consequences, specifically, how well they lead to the end of suffering. In Majjhima Nikaya 58, he distinguishes between truths that are beneficial and those that are not, asserting that only statements both true, corresponding to reality, and useful, conducive to liberation, qualify as right view. This instrumental perspective, akin to Western pragmatism, evaluates views based on the actions they inspire and the results those actions yield. However, unlike some forms of pragmatism, where utility alone, e.g., emotional comfort or material gain, might suffice, the Buddha insists on a dual criterion: correspondence to reality and efficacy in reducing suffering. Practically, this involves a reflective process of assessment. For example, a view that encourages clinging to sensual pleasures might feel comforting but fails the test because it perpetuates craving and suffering, contradicting the second noble truth. Conversely, a view that promotes mindfulness and detachment, though initially challenging, proves beneficial by aligning with the path to cessation, the fourth noble truth. Practitioners must thus evaluate their beliefs by observing their outcomes. Do they increase agitation or peace, bondage or freedom, and adjust accordingly? This ongoing discernment ensures that views remain tools for progress rather than obstacles to it. The Pali Canon outlines 3 types of truth as correspondence from the Vinaya, disciplinary rules, that have practical implications for ending suffering: correspondence of perception, citation, and narrative. First, correspondence of perception requires accurately discerning reality, e.g., recognizing a passionate mind state as such rather than misidentifying it as neutral. In mindfulness practice, this translates to seeing experiences clearly as they arise, fostering honest awareness of suffering and its causes. Second, correspondence of citation involves accurately reporting the basis of one's statements, Majjhima Nikaya 95. Practically, this means acknowledging whether a belief stems from direct experience, reasoning, or hearsay, cultivating intellectual integrity that extends inward to question the origins of personal assumptions. Third, correspondence of narrative demands truthful self-assessment of actions and intentions, as taught to Rahula in Majjhima Nikaya 61. Before, during, and after acting, practitioners must reflect: is this harmful? Does it lead to suffering or release? This honesty builds the self-awareness needed to abandon unskillful habits. Together, these practices sharpen sensitivity to the mind's processes, how views are formed, how actions shape experience, enabling practitioners to let go of arbitrary or harmful attachments. For instance, recognizing that a belief in a permanent self arises from craving, second type, and leads to stress, third type, makes it easier to relinquish, aligning with the path's goal. While the Buddha's focus on consequences echoes Western pragmatism, 2 key differences ensure its practical rigor. First, unlike some pragmatic theories where a useful fiction, e.g., a comforting delusion, might be deemed true, the Buddha requires views to be both true and beneficial. A false view, even if temporarily soothing, cannot end suffering because it misaligns with reality, perpetuating delusion. Second, he provides an objective standard for what works, the cessation of suffering, Nibbana, the third noble truth. Happiness that depends on conditions, like wealth or pleasure, is provisional and unworthy as an ultimate goal, while unbinding offers a changeless peace that serves as the benchmark for all actions and views. Practically, this means prioritizing long-term liberation over short-term gains, choosing practices that erode craving rather than feed it. Ending suffering thus involves a twofold strategy. 1. Adopting right views that reflect reality and lead to Nirvana, and 2. Using them with discernment to cultivate dispassion. Practitioners start by internalizing the Four Noble Truths, applying them through the Eightfold Path, e.g., speaking truthfully, right speech, meditating deeply, right concentration, to weaken attachment. As Majjhima Nikaya 117 notes, right view drives all path factors toward release. Over time, this process turns inward, loosening even the grip on right view itself, as seen in Anthapika's debate in Uttara Nikaya at 10 hours 93 minutes, where he uses right view to transcend views altogether. The practical outcome is a mind unbound, not by rejecting truth, but by using it skillfully until suffering ceases entirely. The Buddha's teachings on truth, Sakka, and views, Daihai, with their intricate dance of affirmation and transcendence, culminate in a profound invitation to embrace truth not as a rigid dogma or final destination, but as a fluid, dynamic process that serves the ultimate aim of ending suffering. The paradox is woven throughout the Pali Canon, asserting the Four Noble Truths as categorical realities while urging practitioners to move beyond all fixed assertions, are not stumbling blocks but signposts, guiding us toward a nuanced relationship with truth that balances conviction with detachment. This conclusion reflects on how this fluid understanding resolves the tensions in the Buddha's message, empowers practitioners to wield truth effectively, and ensures that the path remains the living practice rather than a static creed. At the heart of the Buddha's paradoxes lies a practical wisdom. Truth and views operate on multiple levels, each tailored to the practitioner's stage on the path. The Four Noble Truths stand as unwavering realities. Suffering exists, it has a cause, it can cease, and there is a path to that cessation, offering a clear and reliable framework for those mired in delusion and craving, Daya Nikaya 9. Yet, the Ahakavaga's call to transcend true and false, Sutta Nipata 4-9, reveals that these truths are not ends in themselves but means to an end, tools to be held firmly until liberation is attained, then released like the raft in Majjhima Nikaya 22. This fluidity resolves the apparent contradiction. Truths are categorical in their correspondence to reality and their efficacy, yet provisional in their role as conditioned guides that the awakened mind outgrows. Embracing this fluidity means recognizing that truth shifts in function, not in essence. For the beginner, the Four Noble Truths provide stability, a compass to navigate the chaos of sasra. For the adept, they become stepping stones to a direct encounter with unbinding, nibbana, beyond language or concepts. The Buddha's paradoxical teachings serve as a safeguard against complacency, warning against mistaking the map for the territory or clinging to right view as an identity, Sutta Nipata 4:5. This layered approach ensures that truth remains the living force, adaptable to the practitioner's needs while pointing unwaveringly to the cessation of suffering. A fluid understanding of truth empowers practitioners by transforming how they engage with the Buddha's teachings. Rather than debating abstract notions of true or false, they focus on applying right view, rooted in the Four Noble Truths, as a practical tool for liberation. This involves adopting these truths with full commitment, as Majjhima Nikaya 117 outlines, using them to cultivate the Eightfold Path's factors, right intention, speech, action, and so forth, in a coherent, all-encompassing practice. Consistency is key. Only by holding these truths steadily can practitioners develop the mindfulness, effort, and concentration needed to erode craving and ignorance, the roots of suffering. Yet, this commitment is tempered by an awareness of impermanence. The Buddha's warning in Sutta Nipata 4:11, that clinging to views breeds quarrels and conceit, reminds practitioners to wield truth lightly, with an eye toward its ultimate relinquishment. This balance is exemplified in Anthapika's approach in Uttara Nikaya at 10 hours 93 minutes, where he uses right view to refute sectarian dogmas not by asserting a rival position, but by pointing to the conditioned nature of all views and the escape beyond them. Practically, this means living the teachings, observing suffering, abandoning its causes, and realizing peace, while cultivating the humility to let go when the goal is reached. The more fully one grasps this fluidity, the more effectively one can harness the consequences of right view to dismantle suffering. Embracing truth fluidly reframes it as a path rather than a possession, aligning with the Buddha's pragmatic intent. In Majjhima Nikaya 140, unbinding is the highest noble truth not because it can be owned or proclaimed, but because it provides an objective standard for all other truths, the cessation of suffering as the ultimate measure of efficacy. Practitioners benefit from this by judging their actions and views against this goal, asking, does this lead to dispassion and release, or to further entanglement? The answer lies in experience, not theory, making the path a hands-on journey of trial, reflection, and refinement. This perspective also guards against the pitfalls of intellectual fixation. The Buddha's refusal to be pigeonholed by views, Sutta 4:5, and his critique of those who argue over idiosyncratic truths, Sutta 4:8, highlight the danger of treating truth as a trophy to be won or defended. Instead, he offers a process: use truth to see reality clearly, act skillfully, and let go when it has served its purpose. This fluidity ensures that the teachings remain relevant across contexts, whether for a novice seeking clarity or an arahant embodying freedom, keeping the Dhamma alive as a practice rather than a fossilized doctrine. Ultimately, a fluid understanding of truth liberates by aligning practitioners with the Buddha's vision of unbinding. It acknowledges that truths like the Four Noble Truths are indispensable, for without them, as Daya Nikaya 1 suggests, even the Buddha's own release would not have occurred, yet insists they are not the final word. The awakened teach these truths to others, Majjhima Nikaya 118, not to bind them to concepts, but to equip them with strategies for freedom. The paradox becomes a gift. By holding truth firmly yet flexibly, practitioners master the path's techniques, comprehension, abandonment, realization, development, until they too can stand on the far shore, unbound by even the subtlest clinging. In conclusion, embracing a fluid understanding of truth transforms the Buddha's paradoxes into a roadmap for liberation. It invites us to trust in the Four Noble Truths as guides, apply them with diligence, and release them with wisdom, ensuring that our engagement with truth leads not to rigidity but to the boundless peace of Nibbana. By appreciating this fluidity, we fulfill the Buddha's promise, a truth that frees rather than fetters, a path that ends suffering through the very act of walking it.